Picture a man unfolding a daily newspaper on a crisp morning in April 1909. The paper is the Phoenix Gazette. It is a reputable, politically minded publication, not a cheap tabloid known for printing ghost stories. And yet, there on the front page, the headline makes a claim so massive it seems to bend reality. It announces the discovery of a vast underground citadel carved into the sheer rock walls of the Grand Canyon. It speaks of mummies, of strange hieroglyphs, of a cavern complex large enough to house 50,000 people comfortably, and of an ancient race that migrated to the American Southwest from Egypt or the Orient. According to the article, this staggering find was being excavated by the most prestigious scientific body in the country, the Smithsonian Institution. Today, if you search the official archives of the Smithsonian for the names of the men mentioned in that article, you will find absolutely nothing. The institution states unequivocally that no such expedition ever took place, that no such artifacts were ever recovered, and that the entire story is a fabrication. And yet, vast tracts of the Grand Canyon remain heavily restricted today, off-limits to hikers, closed off by federal law, and shielded by flight restrictions. So we are left with two completely incompatible realities. Either the Phoenix Gazette published a colossal, multi-page lie that fooled a generation, or an institution dedicated to preserving human history chose to erase one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time. We're going to look at the newspaper report itself, at the precise details the explorer claimed to have seen, at what the official archives do and do not contain, and at what the indigenous people of that land were saying centuries before any Westerner arrived in a wooden boat. To understand what might be hidden in the walls of the canyon, you first have to understand the world as it was long before the 1909 expedition. Long before any newspaper reporter ever set foot in Arizona, the people who lived along the Colorado River already knew the canyon, and they treated it with a reverence and a caution that had nothing to do with a fear of heights or rough water. To the Hopi people, the canyon is not a tourist destination. It is the place of emergence. It is history. According to Hopi oral tradition, humanity has lived through several previous worlds, each destroyed by a cataclysm of fire or ice. During the destruction of the Third World, the ancestors of the Hopi were saved by a mysterious group they call the Anu Sinom, or the Ant People. The tradition says that these beings led the humans underground, into a vast network of subterranean caverns. Down in the dark, they were given shelter, they were taught how to store food, and they survived while the surface of the earth was scoured clean. When the surface was safe again, humanity emerged from the underground through a portal, a physical location in the Grand Canyon known as the Sipapu. To us, listening from the comfort of the modern world, it sounds like mythology. It sounds like folklore designed to explain the harshness of the desert. But to people who have survived in that unforgiving landscape for over 1,000 years, it was practical history. Oral tradition is not a fairy tale told around a fire. It is a method of preserving data. It is a chain of memory, passed from grandparent to grandchild, guarded with strict rules against alteration. When the elders spoke of underground cities, they were not speaking in metaphors. They were describing a physical reality, a place of sanctuary carved into the living rock, kept hidden from the outside world. Think about the sheer scale of the Grand Canyon. It is 277 miles long, up to 18 miles wide, and over a mile deep. Even today, with satellite imagery and drones, there are side canyons, alcoves, and cliff faces that no human being has walked on in centuries, perhaps ever. In the early 1900s, it was a black hole on the map. It was a place of total isolation. The idea that a massive structure could exist down there, completely unseen from the rim, was not just possible, it was highly probable. The geography itself protects its secrets. This is not just about an old legend. It is about how we view the memory of indigenous peoples. For decades, Western historians treated these oral accounts as primitive imagination. But if you assume the traditions are rooted in a historical event, a physical place, then the story of a hidden underground city is not a sudden invention of a 20th century newspaper. It is a narrative that predates the United States by centuries. If you enjoy stories the history books quietly skipped, consider subscribing, because this channel lives on tracking down these forgotten voices. We are going to look at what the newspaper article actually reported, at the astonishing physical details the explorer provided, at the reasons why the official version leaves so much unexplained, and at why the geology of the canyon makes this mystery so difficult to close. Because decades after the Hopi told their stories of underground sanctuaries, a completely different group of people arrived in the canyon, and what they recorded should not have matched the native traditions at all. But it did. The date is April 5, 1909. The Phoenix Gazette prints a massive story under the headline, "Explorations in Grand Canyon." The article is incredibly detailed, running for thousands of words. It focuses on a man named G.E. Kincaid. According to the paper, Kincaid was not some amateur treasure hunter. He was described as an explorer who had been working for the Smithsonian for 30 years, a man accustomed to the hardships of the wilderness. He had been traveling alone in a wooden boat down the Colorado River, searching for minerals, drifting through the steep, treacherous gorges where the walls rise thousands of feet straight up from the water. Here is what Kincaid claimed happened. About 42 miles up the river from the El Tovar Crystal Canyon, he noticed a strange discoloration on the eastern wall of the gorge. It was about 2,000 feet above the riverbed. There was no trail, there was no obvious way up, but something about the rock formation caught his trained eye. He tied up his boat and began the grueling, dangerous climb up the nearly vertical cliff face. When he finally reached the source of the discoloration, he did not find a natural cave. He found an entrance, and the entrance, according to his own account, was clearly modified by human hands. It was situated under a massive shelf of rock, perfectly hidden from the river below and completely invisible from the rim above. Kincaid stepped out of the blinding Arizona sun and into the dark. What happened next did not just confirm the old native stories, it expanded on them in a way that defied every accepted timeline of human history in the Americas. Kincaid reported that the main passage was about 12 feet wide, narrowing to 9 feet, and it ran straight back into the rock for a massive distance. He walked in the dark for what he estimated was several hundred feet until he reached a central chamber. This was not a natural cavern system carved by water. Kincaid described a highly engineered layout. The central chamber was like the hub of a giant wheel, and from it, dozens of passageways radiated outward in perfect geometric symmetry. It was an underground citadel. Kincaid claimed he explored the complex and found it to be vast, capable of housing upwards of 50,000 people. But it was not the size that made the story explosive. It was what he found inside. Look closely at the details he provided to the reporter. In the main chamber, he claimed to have found a massive shrine. On the shrine sat an idol, carved with a serene expression, holding a lotus flower in each hand. Kincaid compared it directly to the Buddha. Surrounding this central figure were smaller images and tools made of a hardened copper, a metallurgical skill that Orthodox history says did not exist in the ancient Americas. Notice the specificity of his claims. He did not just say he found old pots. He described finding granaries, massive stone receptacles filled with seeds. He described a dining hall several hundred feet long. And then he described the crypt. In one of the radiating spokes of the cavern, he found rows upon rows of mummies. They were resting on shelves carved directly into the rock. Each mummy was wrapped in a dark, mysterious fabric, and beside each one was a small copper cup and pieces of broken swords. And on the walls, carved into the stone near the entrance, were hieroglyphs. Kincaid stated that they resembled the picture writing of ancient Egypt. He suggested, right there in the article, that the people who built this cyclopean city were of Oriental origin, possibly migrating from Egypt to the Americas thousands of years before Columbus. This is the point where the story becomes a sensation. Kincaid claimed that he brought several artifacts back to Yuma, Arizona, and shipped them directly to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. The article explicitly stated that a Professor S.A. Jordan of the Smithsonian was currently analyzing the artifacts, that he had verified their importance, and that a massive, well-funded expedition was already underway. According to the Gazette, a team of 30 to 40 archaeologists were either in the canyon or on their way to continue the excavation. Every time you read through this account, the sheer audacity of the claims jumps out at you. It is specific. It names names. It names locations. It describes metallurgy, architecture, and religious iconography. It leaves no room for misinterpretation. Kincaid was claiming that a highly advanced civilization, connected to the ancient Near East, had lived out its days in a massive fortress inside the Grand Canyon. So we are left with a spectacular, world-changing announcement. And you would expect that the following weeks would be filled with updates, photographs, and scientific debates. You would expect the Smithsonian to hold a press conference. But that is exactly what makes this case so deeply unsettling. Because the moment the article went to print, the silence that followed was absolute. When modern researchers and even curious citizens over the past century have reached out to the Smithsonian Institution to ask about G.E. Kincaid, the artifacts, and the underground city, the response has always been the same. It is a flat, uncompromising denial. The institution states that it has no record of a G.E. Kincaid ever working for them. They have no record of a Professor S.A. Jordan. They have no copper weapons, no mummies, no hieroglyphs, and absolutely no documentation of an expedition to an underground citadel in the Grand Canyon in 1909. If you take the official denial at face value, the entire story collapses into a simple explanation. It was a hoax. And to be fair to the skeptics, the era of the early 20th century was the golden age of yellow journalism. Newspapers across the American West frequently printed tall tales to sell copies. They made up stories about petrified men, lost gold mines, and phantom ships. The idea that a bored reporter or a sensational editor fabricated the entire Kincaid story from thin air is the most common and, frankly, the easiest explanation. But there is something investigators have always found troubling about simply dismissing it as a hoax. And when you look closely at the context, the hoax theory starts to show its own cracks. First, consider the newspaper itself. The Phoenix Gazette was not a pulp magazine. It was a serious publication focused on politics, agriculture, and local news, printing a massive, multi-page lie on the front page, naming a real federal institution like the Smithsonian, carried legal and reputational risks. And yet, the Gazette never printed a retraction. They never apologized for the story. They just let it stand. And then there is the detail in Kincaid's account. Why would a reporter fabricating a story include such specific architectural details, like the geometric hub and spoke design, which is incredibly difficult to carve into solid rock, but matches the descriptions of ancient subterranean cities found in places like Turkey? Why include the detail about hardened copper? Why not just say he found gold, which is what every other hoax of that era claimed to attract investors? Kincaid explicitly said there was no gold, only copper and gray metals. That is a strange choice for a con man trying to get rich. Now put it together with the landscape itself. The Grand Canyon is not just a hole in the ground. It is a labyrinth of limestone, sandstone, and shale, full of natural caves. We know for a fact that indigenous peoples used caves in the region for storage, for shelter, and for burials. Split twig figurines, some dating back 4,000 years, have been found in remote caves in the canyon walls. So the premise of a cave containing artifacts is not a fantasy. It is an archaeological reality. And this is where the two stories finally meet. And the friction between them is what makes this mystery survive. The Hopi legend warned of an underground sanctuary holding ancient ancestors. The Phoenix Gazette reported a massive underground citadel holding ancient mummies. Two completely different sources from two completely different worlds pointing to the exact same concept in the exact same geographic region. But there was something none of the early researchers had checked yet. And when modern investigators began to look at the maps of the Grand Canyon, a new layer emerged that completely changed the shape of the debate. Look at the names of the peaks, the buttes, and the natural temples inside the Grand Canyon. If you look at a topographical map today, you will see names that stand out immediately. There is the Isis Temple, the Tower of Set, the Cheops Pyramid, the Hindu Amphitheater, the Buddha Temple, the Shiva Temple. For a completely American landscape, the heart of the canyon is named entirely after Egyptian and Eastern deities. The official explanation for this is simple. In the late 19th century, a geologist named Clarence Dutton was mapping the canyon. He was a romantic, a man of literature, and he felt that the grand sweeping rock formations resembled the architecture of the ancient world. So, he named them after Egyptian and Hindu gods simply for poetic effect. The official line is that this has absolutely nothing to do with Kincaid or his supposed underground city. But this is the moment the whole case turns. Because if that detail is just a coincidence, it is a staggering one. Kincaid claimed he found Egyptian and Buddhist-style artifacts. The exact region where he supposedly found them is surrounded by peaks named after Egyptian and Buddhist deities. Did Kincaid invent his story by looking at Dutton's map and using the names as inspiration? Or did Dutton, mapping the canyon decades before Kincaid, see something, find something, or hear a native legend that influenced him to use those specific names? And it gets deeper. If you try to go to the area where the Isis Temple and the Tower of Set are located today, you will find it incredibly difficult. Large portions of the Grand Canyon are heavily restricted. There are massive zones where hikers are not allowed to go, where trails are unmaintained and closed off, and where you can face federal charges for trespassing. Furthermore, the airspace over certain parts of the canyon is strictly regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration. Skeptics will rightly point out that the airspace is restricted because of tragic helicopter crashes in the past and to preserve the natural silence of the park. They will point out that caves are closed off because they contain delicate bat ecosystems, or because they are protected under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The federal government restricts access to protect the canyon, not to hide an Egyptian city. But try telling that to someone who has read the 1909 article. When you have a story about a massive, unacknowledged archaeological site, and then you see physical gates, legal threats, and restricted airspace over the exact area where the site is supposed to be, the suspicion is inevitable. Every time investigators try to close the case by saying it was just a newspaper hoax, the physical reality of the locked-down canyon pulls the mystery back open. Which leaves only two explanations. Either a journalist in 1909 spun a brilliant, lucky lie that accidentally aligned with Hopi legend and perfectly matched the future restricted zones of a national park, or the story was not entirely a lie. So what actually happened out there? After everything we have seen, the legends, the reports, the geography, it is finally possible to say what the evidence most strongly points to. We have to look past the sensationalism of the early 20th century. In 1909, if an explorer found something spectacular, something that showed immense engineering skill, the racial bias of the time made it very difficult for them to attribute it to Native Americans. The prevailing thought was that the indigenous people were primitive. Therefore, if you found a massive, sophisticated citadel, the logic of the era dictated that it must have been built by a lost white race, or Egyptians, or someone from the Orient. So here is what likely happened. Not the wild legend of aliens, not the official line that absolutely nothing occurred, but the version every piece of evidence finally points to. It is highly probable that G.E. Kincaid was a real person, or at least a prospector operating under a pseudonym, who genuinely found something massive in the canyon walls. He likely found a spectacular ancestral Puebloan or Hopi cave complex. It was probably vast. It likely contained granaries, tools, and, yes, mummies, perfectly preserved by the dry desert air, wrapped in woven textiles. He found a masterpiece of indigenous engineering, a sacred site of survival exactly like the ones the Hopi oral tradition spoke of. He brought this discovery to the attention of the newspaper, but a story about a large Native American ruin does not sell papers across the country. A story about ancient Egyptians does. So Kincaid, or the editor of the Gazette, embellished. The woven textiles became Egyptian shrouds, the indigenous religious figures became the Buddha, the ancient petroglyphs became Egyptian hieroglyphs. They took a genuine, breathtaking indigenous site and dressed it up in the clothing of an Oriental mystery to make it a sensation. And what about the Smithsonian? It is entirely possible that representatives from the institution did hear about the find. In those days, the Smithsonian was aggressively collecting artifacts from the American West, often with little regard for the sacred nature of the sites. They may have sent an investigator, completely unrecorded in the formal ledgers, to assess the cave. When the investigator arrived, they did not find an Egyptian city filled with gold. They found a massive Native American burial and storage site. Realizing that the newspaper had completely exaggerated the Egyptian angle, the institution simply walked away from the public story. They may have quietly removed the artifacts to add to their vast, uncatalogued collections in Washington. Or they may have left the site alone. But they certainly were not going to hold a press conference to admit they investigated a newspaper hoax. They buried the paperwork, denied the existence of Kincaid in Jordan, and closed the book. Think back. The matching detail no outsider could have known. The restricted points on the map. The absolute silence from the institution. Each one, alone, could be dismissed. Together, they describe a very specific sequence of events. The legend and the report were never truly in conflict. They were describing the same physical place from two ends of a century. One described it as a sacred warning and a testament to survival. The other described it as a colonial treasure hunt. What connected them was real. We cannot prove every last detail. No one can at this distance in time, without the federal government allowing a full, independent archaeological survey of the restricted caves. But of every explanation ever offered, this is the only one that leaves nothing unaccounted for. And that is the quiet weight of it. Not a lost secret hidden by a vanished race of Egyptians, but ordinary, spectacular human brilliance. The ancestors of the Hopi built something so grand, so enduring, that when modern men finally stumbled upon it, their minds could not comprehend that indigenous people had done it. They had to invent a fantasy about Egypt to explain a reality that was right in front of them. But the answer is not really where this story ends, because what it tells us about ourselves is the part that lingers. We like to think that history is an open book, that the archives are perfectly organized, and that if something massive existed, we would surely know about it. But this story is proof that knowledge is incredibly fragile. A site can exist in the physical world, be known to the local people for 1,000 years, be discovered by an explorer, be printed on the front page of a newspaper, and still completely disappear from the official record. History is not just what happened. History is what the people in power choose to write down. When we call an indigenous oral tradition a myth, and we treat an institutional denial as absolute truth, we lose the actual human story. The people who lived along that river were trying to tell us something for centuries. They told us the earth was hollow in places. They told us their ancestors survived there. And we ignored them until a man in a wooden boat claimed he found Egyptians. Every time you look at a landscape and assume there is nothing left to find, you are making a mistake. The earth keeps its own records. Remember that front page of the Phoenix Gazette we started with? The headline that seemed too massive to be true. Look at it again now. It is no longer just a piece of yellow journalism. It is a distorted mirror reflecting a genuine monument of human survival that is likely still sitting there, silent, in the dark, thousands of feet above the Colorado River. Some doors, once someone warns you about them, you never walk past the same way again. I want to ask you this. Is there a story like this where you grew up? A place, a local legend, a restricted area that everyone knows about but no one can prove? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and the comments under these videos are half the reason I make them. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, the ones the history books quietly skipped, the ones that require you to think rather than just believe, then subscribe. That is the only way you will catch the next one, and there are stranger ones coming. If it kept you here to the end, a like genuinely helps more people find the channel. That is not a small thing. It is the whole reason independent research like this survives. Thank you for staying with me all the way through. Keep asking why the quiet places are quiet. I will see you in the next one.